All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Anna Hall. I am the CEO of the Northeast Charter Schools Network, and I'm joined here by Chris Cromwell and Aditya Kadu, who will introduce themselves momentarily, and I'll turn this over to them shortly. Wanted to thank you for joining. I apologize that I'm not on video. I'm having significant technical issues. This is what my on video looks like. That beautiful black screen, very slimming. So I will just share my my headshot for now. So if you have questions over the course of the session, please use the Q&A and not the chat. We'll facilitate those questions at the end, but feel free to add them in the Q&A over the course of the session. We're really thrilled and appreciate having the presenters here today, and also want to note that on May 19th, we will be hosting a follow-up session that is specifically geared for your boards. So a combination of charter school business management and the education board partners will be presenting information for charter school boards related to COVID, the federal COVID funding, and governance questions that boards may have related to this. So we'll be sending out more information about that. And you can pass it along to your boards. If you have other questions that aren't covered today, please also let us know. We know that this is a topic of significant interest, and I know I speak for Chris and Aditya when I say that they are also willing to be resources to you after today. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, gentlemen.
Great. Thank you so much. Welcome everybody to this week's webinar. As Anna said, I'm Chris Cromwell. I'm here with Aditya Kadu, and we're going to talk to you today about what we call funding Tetris, which is essentially just how do you make the most out of your complicated funding sources. Before we dive in, just want to say thank you to New York Charter Schools Association and any charters for hosting us. We're really excited to be here. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. You can go to the next slide. We're going to introduce ourselves clearly, and then we're going to do three things. We're going to take a look at the new funding that's available from all of the COVID legislation. This is the hot topic across the country in finance, in education finance. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to dive into some of the reasons and some of the best practices around thinking strategically and proactively about your restricted funding sources so that you get the benefit of lower labor and easier time and more money. And then we're going to talk through, I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of benefits that you get on that front. So an example of reducing compliance labor, and then some examples of ways to reduce actual compliance, the burden of the actual rules that you face. And then we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A and a robust discussion. And I can say on that front that I know, we know from the survey, which by the way, thank you for all of those who filled out the survey, super useful information. And we know from that there's a mix of people planning on joining us today or with us today, from CFOs whose work is deep in the trenches of finance and DFOs, to school leaders and maybe a teacher or two doing some special work, who maybe don't work as deeply or intensely in the finance world. And so we have designed the webinar today to be a very general look at these concepts. And our request for the folks out there who are CFO, DFOs, and deep in this and doing a lot of this work probably already is to reflect over this presentation on your own experience and expertise and knowledge, and bring that into the Q&A we're going to have. I think that collectively, we are much more valuable to each other than any of us individually, and I'm excited to be a part of that conversation when we get there. So let's jump in and let us tell you who we are. As I said earlier, my name is Chris Cromwell. I'm a consultant. I work nationally, and I provide what I call CFO, COO suite services, which is essentially anything that you would expect from a CFO or COO, ranging from a project-based engagement to sometimes I step in and serve as a CFO or COO on an interim basis. I have worked with a bunch of not-for-profits and a lot of charter groups and school systems and ed organizations. The work I'm most proud of, though, is helping found and run Haven's Charter School down here in New Orleans. which to this day remains one of the highest growth schools in Louisiana. Also a quick note that in addition that I've got an MBA from the Simon School at the University of Rochester. So like shout out to New York State and those folks from Rochester who are joining us today. Loved my time in that city. So with that, let me hand it over to Aditya to introduce himself.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everybody. My name is Aditya Kadu, and I'm the founder and CEO of Edstruments. And Edstruments is a software company that has set out to address many of the challenges that leaders like you all face in more effectively managing and planning the use of financial resources in your schools. I started my career as a charter school teacher, and that's really where my passion for education and education equity came. And then spent some time in graduate studies at Stanford, pursuing an MBA and MA in education prior to launching Edstruments a couple of years ago. Edstruments works with school systems across the country in multiple states, including New York, with primarily charter school systems, but also traditional school districts to help really empower leaders to own, understand, and track their resources so that they can put them to best use for students. Excited to be here with you all today and delighted to be co-presenting with Chris. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about some of the core guiding philosophies that inform the way we think about this work, and that we hope at some level that each of you share. First and foremost, for us, it's all about students, and I'm sure for many of you too. How can we maximize positive impact and equity for the learners who show up in your schools every day? Second is thinking about educators, and many of you on the call identify as educators, but everyone here is playing a role to support educators in one way or another. And so how can we empower and involve those leaders to be the budgetary decision and doing it's done year after year, especially with all this inflow of extra funding? How can afford managing funds, planning their use in a way that's proactive and not reactive, which also helps with this fifth topic here around reducing compliance burdens wherever at all possible. And I will move forward here. Chris, looks like a couple of people are having a hard time hearing me. Is this any better?
Yeah, you've been better since the end of that slide, but I think in the middle of that slide, we missed a little bit of the, probably those middle bullet points is when, for me, you started breaking up and buffering a little bit.
Got it. Apologies, team. I'm hoping that all of you saw those points, and I won't go back and belabor them, but just suffice it to say, we have these guiding philosophies that'll inform the information that you'll see here. So now for the topic of the day, which many of you are here for, and we saw in the pre-survey, a lot of you have questions on your mind about what's the deal with all this new federal funding? How much am I going to get? When is it going to arrive? We're going to address many of those topics over the course of the presentation, as well as the Q&A here. So let's dive in. First, there's a lot of acronyms out there, a little bit of alphabet soup. So again, as Chris was saying, we want to make sure that we get in at the foundational level and make sure everyone knows what all of these are. So there were three major pieces of legislation passed in the last year. First, the CARES Act, and then CRRSA, and then ARP, most recently, the American Rescue Plan. And each of these created a different ESSER fund. And ESSER stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. And that's money that's being distributed to states by the federal government, and states then pass it on to LEAs like yourselves. The first two of those acts also created separate pools called Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funds. And so these two big categories, ESSER and GEAR, are what make up the majority of the federal COVID relief funding. A couple of fast facts, just so we're all on the same page here. Each of the subsequent acts created more and more money for schools across the country. CARES Act, had the lowest with about $13 billion in its ESSER pool. And then ESSER 2 came out with about 4 times as much of the money as ESSER 1. And then the ARP ESSER program came out with twice as much as ESSER 2. So all of these have been added together as large pools of funding that are going to be available to all of you. And now a quick note on these usage deadlines here. This comes directly from the Department of Education at the federal government level. Some of you might be looking at those first ones and saying, September of this year, I thought I had at least until next year, and you do. So there's something called the Tidings Amendment, which allows unspent money by that September 30th, 2021 deadline to roll over as carryover funds for next year. But technically, the usage deadline as stated by the federal government is this September for that first tranche of funding. So all in all together, your ARP ESSER funds will be able to be used through September of 2024 when you consider that extra 12-month period. These have rolling deadlines, and so it's something to keep track of as you're working over the course of the next few years. Couple things to note, broad similarities. And a lot of you are asking about how do I know how much I'm going to get? It's generally proportional to your Title I allocation. So states are required to distribute 90% of the money that the federal government gave them to LEAs based on Title I numbers from 2019 to 2020. And from the pre-survey, we know that many of you on the line have high percentage of Title I students, Title I eligible students in your campuses. And so these are, you're likely to receive a significant amount of this money. With that last ARP ESSER, New York State has received about $9 billion total. And so by that 90% is about $8.1 billion that's going to be going out to education agencies, school districts, charter networks like yourselves. A lot of questions were there around what can I use this money for? And the ESSERs are quite broad in terms of what they allow you to spend this money on. So it could be everything from hiring people and avoiding layoffs to summer school to devices and software and instructional materials. So the usages are quite broad. What we will say is that these last two versions of ESSER, ESSER 2 and ARP ESSER have specific provisions for learning loss mitigation and making sure that you're spending some of these funds to address what has been documented throughout the country over the last year as a significant learning loss. The last point that I'll make on this is every one of these funds has to be individually tracked. So the expenses you're logging against it, the priorities that you're spending on, they have to be tracked separately for ESSER funds, from GEAR funds, and from the others. So having detailed plans in place for how you're going to keep track of that money is really important. I will move here. So a few key differences between these three. ESSER 1 and GEAR 1, that first CARES Act pool of money was the only one to require provision of equitable services to non-public students. So think about like private school students or others who aren't part of the public school system. There were funding pools in ESSER 1 that required that spend. The most recent ones, ESSER 2 and ARP ESSER, had separate discretionary pools where the governor could spend on non-public school students, but it wasn't required in the key ESSER legislation itself. The next one, ESSER 2, and it was the last one to actually have this government emergency relief fund. So, and it was the first to stipulate funds being used for learning loss mitigation. So with ESSER 1, there's no requirement saying, hey, you've got to use some of this for learning loss. It was really to help, schools reopen in some cases or pay for new technology and to go to more one-to-one models. So this was the first one to really recognize, hey, there's been some significant learning loss. And then ARP ESSER came in on top of that to say, hey, we've got to actually designate 20% minimum of this money to addressing learning loss in especially high risk, high need populations. And there was no GEAR portion. So there is no GEAR 3 or ARP GEAR. Governors only get discretion over that last 10% of ESSER funds that were not earmarked for LEAs. Of course, this all just adds on to the long list of federal funds and restricted pools of money at that you're already used to tracking or having to keep track of over the last several years. Many of those are here. You're well familiar with them. We saw from the pre-survey that many of you or all of you receive at least one of these, if not several. And so that really creates this big requirement and challenge of how are we going to strategically manage all these different pools and use them in the best way. And so for that, I'll hand it over to Chris to talk through our next topic here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aditya. So yeah, let's talk about what we mean when we are saying like, hey, it's a good idea to look at your funding streams strategically and proactively. And let's start that conversation by talking about the reasons that you might want to do it. What do you get out of it? So first and foremost, get all your money. We all face this, the reality that education funding is largely drawdown funding. So if you don't have your allocations down or your plan down and you're scrambling at the last minute, sometimes you leave money on the table. I work with a lot of clients who are facing this and scrambling to try to avoid it or trying to avoid it, set themselves up to avoid it in the next year. Second is, of the money that you get to end the year with, your net assets, you should maximize those being as unrestricted as possible, right? You should maximize the number of unrestricted assets you end your year with, simply because you can do more with them down the road. And so, one of the things we saw in our survey, right, is a bunch of questions about like, well, how can we spend this money? And how do we talk about growth? What if we want to add a high school or a middle school or a primary school? And if you have a large pool of unrestricted dollars, you are freer to do that. Third is you can just make it less expensive to be a compliant organization. And deeply related to that is fourth, you can make it more enjoyable to be a compliant organization, which in turn leads to things like lower turnover and just general joy, which I don't think anybody's going to argue against. So with those in mind, let's get into a little bit then about how you do that, how you do this stuff. And you can go to the next slide, Vidya. And let's ground that conversation in, oh, sorry, I forgot, I skipped a slide in my head. The real reason then, if you do all of those things from the previous slide, what it leads to is that you as a finance team, you get to say yes more often to your teachers and your students, which to me is like the raison d'etre of finance department in a school. In what Havens I had written in big paint on the back of my office, we say yes. And we really tried to live up to that. All right, now we go to the next slide. Let's ground our conversation in some guiding principles. Some guiding principles of how to like move from reactive to proactive and strategic looking at funding, at your funding sources. First and foremost, earliest expiring dollars, you got to tackle those first. Pretty common sense. Second, the most restricted dollars you got to tackle first, only to make your job easier down the road. That is also, for what it's worth, compliant with GAAP. But it will set you up, even to me, more importantly than that, it'll set you up nicely to do more of what you want to do. And then third, this is the real, the trickiest guiding principle here. You should work to integrate this work deeply and directly into your annual budget process. And if you do that, everything else that you do after that will become easier. And it's easy enough to skip this, in your budget process, but man, it pays multitudes if you do it. One of the ways to start that is you need to just get a list of your funding sources. That list needs to be mutually exclusive and collectively comprehensive. So it needs to include everything, and there needs to be no overlap between them. And if you have that list, then you can fit this into however you budget, either whether it's in spreadsheet or you use another tool, but you will have a resource that is whole and not redundant to do that. And you can see here, we've ordered these as an example in order from most restrictive to least restrictive. There's always some wiggle room here, and anybody's individual organization experience might be a little bit different than that. So if you're looking at this and thinking, oh, wow, one should move up or down, that's probably true. The key here is when you make your list like this, that you have the order that makes sense and is right for your organization and your pool of funding. Also just want to point out that I've thrown the ESSERs in there on the third bullet point down from the top. Specifically, that's because we know they're less restrictive than your title funding. You can do more with them than your individual titles. And they're less restrictive, they're slightly less restrictive than general purpose government federal funding. So I threw them there in the third point. Cool. So with those as guiding principles down, and we know why we're doing it, let's talk a little bit about how we make this work. And could you go to the next slide, Aditya? I want to talk. We want to do two things with you. We want to show you two examples of a really high-level way of how you would tackle this in a process, in a budget process, or in a planning and management process. I'm going to show you a spreadsheet. It's a little example spreadsheet that I built for this webinar, but it looks and would function a lot like spreadsheets that I've built for clients over and over and over again to add this element into their budget process. And then Aditya is going to walk you through instruments, which has been built specifically to tackle this in a much more integrated with your accounting system way. So let's start. I'm going to jump over and share my screen real quick. Give me 1 second to get that up and running. And just very quickly show you this spreadsheet. So this, for me, in terms of where this would fit into the budget process, this would be a tab in a budget process that I would be running from a pretty large and complex spreadsheet. Other parts of that spreadsheet would be the main budget, right? That just shows you like kind of summary level where we are in our budgeting, making sure that like we're not going deeply into the hole, that there's more revenues than expenses, or that everything's in line with our plan. There'd also probably be tabs that I would that would pull information from requests that I've made to different department leaders, division leads, anybody who's a budget manager and should have input into the budget process. I would have incorporated that into a large kind of omnibus budget spreadsheet. This piece would be a piece that mostly I would work in and the finance team would work in, and we would tackle it and use this to make sure that we had an exact plan for all of these funding sources so that we could, from month one, build into the bones of our finance process, coding this stuff correctly and getting it right from the outset so that we don't have to do what so often ends up having to happen, which is like toward the end of the year or the end of the grant cycle, a lot of scrambling to allocate expenses to the right funding source so that you make sure you spend all the money and your report is good and you're compliant. And you can see the general structure here. I've got the funding sources across the top. In the columns, I've got the matching revenues for each of those columns, and they match up to chart of accounts, which would go down the left side of the screen. And so that I know that like, oh yeah, my title money, it is federal revenue, it's matching up to the right chart of accounts there. And then basically could use this as a real planning tool to take all of my expenses and go, okay, well, I know I'm putting an extra teacher into a classroom, and their whole salary is going to be paid for by Title I. And let's make this teacher a very well-paid teacher. They are paid $150,000 a year, which is my general position about where teachers should be paid when we all have the funding to do it. But you can see how you could use this, and then you start to make sure that you're spending all of your Title I money, and you do it for each of your restricted sources. So that just gives you, we're not going to spend any more time on this, but just gives you a sense of like an organizing system for tackling the planning of this from the outset. And then from this process, after the budget was finished and passed, I would build out the specific processes and get the information to the people who run those processes in order to make sure that I got as much coding right throughout the year from the first go as possible. So with that, let me turn off my screen share and hand it back to Aditya to show you how Instruments tackles the same problem.
Thank you, Chris. And, going to keep this very high level. We know you came here for content, but just wanted to share that everything that Chris just told you about in that spreadsheet is something that Estroments was really designed to tackle effectively, to help you map all these different funding streams, where that money is going towards, planning that, and then keeping track of it over the course of the year. So what you're looking at right now is, a version of the Estroments dashboard, which has, fictional data for a school system here. And we break Estroments into sort of two broad categories, budgets being categories of expenditure, and then resources being, those different pools of funding. You'll even see some of the ones like GEAR and ESSER and, foundation aid that you get from the state here as well. Color-wise, what you're looking at just quickly here, blue represents actual spend, yellow is planned spending or encumbrances, and green is what's available to spend. Red showing situations where a budget might be overspent and have gone past what was planned for in that year. You're also looking right now at a view across multiple schools. For the rest of this, I'm going to just dive into a single school view here with Bennett Elementary, and then take a look at how Bennett Elementary might have planned out different sources of funding. So let's take that really restricted pool like IDEA funds, which can only be used for special education purposes. Here in Estroments, you can keep track of how much this pool of money is for Bennett Elementary School, and then dive in deeper into what restrictions does it have. You can see descriptions here, storing it all in one place of what this money is supposed to be used for. And then you can see at a budget level, sort of like Chris had in the bottom part of the spreadsheet, how much has been allocated out to different expense categories from that pool of funding. And so far, how much has been spent? So in this case, we had about 45,000 that was allocated out to special education supplies and materials. And you can see how much has been spent out of that, about 37. And then if you wanted to dig into transaction level data for any of the expenditures here, you could do that right in here. If we wanted to check out some ESSER funds, it's as easy as just typing it into here, looking at my ESSER money, seeing what that's been allocated out towards, and then being able to click in and see. So just like we have here, different pools of funding and what budgets that money has been planned out towards, which can be set up during like the planning process and capabilities of this. We also have the Converse View, where you can look at any of these budgets and see what exactly has been, what resources are funding that budget, what transactions are coming out of that budget, and so on. And it's very easy to dive into an analysis of transactions. You can look at transactions across all your new sources of funding together. So I wanted to look at just everything that I've bought with ESSER money. You can do that and look at roll-up information like, hey, we've spent a total of this much across this many transactions, and you can sort them from biggest to smallest, whatever it might be, so that you can see over the course of the year, what are we actually spending out of these pools of funding versus what do we plan to spend it on, and be able to keep track of that all in one place. So no manual updating of spreadsheets. We sync directly with your accounting platform to pull transactions out of it and display it here for the leaders who need access to it. So it might not just be you, could also be your school level leaders or school operational leaders, so that they can have access to their budgets, their funding sources, and know where they're at. So I'll go ahead and pause on this. Of course, if any of you are interested in learning more about Estroments, feel free to reach out. After the webinar, we'll share our contact details here at the end, but want to make sure we can get back into talking about compliance. Pass it back to Chris.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I was just about to start talking and realized I hadn't unmuted. Classic pandemic year problem. So I can say too that I have not taken a deep dive into Estroments in actually doing this work, but I've been working with Aditya for the last month or so, and like I am thrilled to be able to jump into it and to run one of these processes through it. It looks to me like it is a powerful engine for that. So let's switch gears here for a second and talk a little bit about two of the benefits you get from moving to proactive and strategic outlook on your restricted funding. Want to talk about this in two ways. I want to talk about reducing all of your labor around compliance, which I also include in that, like audit costs, because if you do this the right way, you can usually negotiate with your auditor lower costs because they know that they're going to spend fewer hours on it. But also definitely your own response cost. And then also, depending on how you use money, particular money, like you might set yourself up to just have less compliance to face to begin with. And that's the savings of time and energy and stress and anxiety. So let's dive in first and talk about reducing labor around compliance. Would you throw the next slide, Aditya? So just like I'm an advocate for integrating funding Tetris into your budget process really tightly, and a big proponent of how much value you get down the road with reduction of labor and just your processes. I'm an equally strong advocate for integrating your strategic planning like deeply into the bones of those processes that you build for the rest of the year. And I want to just talk to you a couple examples of that. So if you can build out your weekly, monthly process, like your accounts payable process or your payroll process, so that all the coding, because you have a tight plan from the get-go, all of your coding is just in line and codes your Title I teachers to Title I and codes your Title II interventionists to Title II. And same with all of your expenses. Then you just have far less work down the road for yourself to make sure that's right as you come up to the end of grant periods. But also when you get to your audit, when your auditors come and ask you for the sample and you have to go find the documentation for the sample that they've pulled, if you've done it that way, you're just going to have to go find their sample of whatever it is, 30 or 40 or however many they've asked for. If instead you haven't gotten it right and baked into your processes, then you've had to do this at some point towards the end of the grant period with adjusting journal entries. And I have firsthand experience with how that process, which is understandable and necessary a lot of the times, can explode the labor around an audit. And it does that by, if you get, let's say you use an adjusting entry to move $30,000 of supplies, ed supplies purchases over into, let's say, ESSER, right? And you're getting audited and you're under civil audit and they pull this sample and they get that AJE and it's 32,000 and some odd dollars. Well, then they're going to ask you for the list of transactions that make up that AJE, and then they're going to sample from that list. And if there's an AJE in that list, then it's going to go to another level. And what should be a sample poll of 30 or 40 or 50 things becomes a sample poll of hundreds of things. And what should have been a few hours of your team's work becomes weeks of your team's work. And your auditors are going to increase their bid next year too. So something to be careful of. Best practice is get it like built into the bones of your finance processes. When you can't do that, the best practice for when you have to use an adjusting journal entry is recreate the transaction level detail. So let's say for that $32,000, instead of just doing a journal entry of $32,000 and having a schedule that kind of shows what makes up that $32,000, recreate every transaction line in the lines of your journal entry. So that journal entry itself has 25 lines in it, or 30 lines or 40 lines in it, which is a little more work up front. But then two things happen down the road. One, when you're doing forensic stuff and you're trying to figure out what happened 2 years ago, what did we do? Did we spend it all? Is this right? It's easy for you to find what makes up your ESSER fund, your ESSER spending. Same for your auditors. And if they pull something up, if one of those line items gets pulled in the sample, it's just going to be the line item, not the full AJE. So it saves you some work down the road and makes your life a lot easier. It does require a little more labor up front, which basically all of the strategies we're talking about today require that. But that's why we have an idiom about that. So those two things are worth thinking about in terms of reducing your overall labor. And if you do them right, you should also be able to reduce your audit expense. The flip side of the benefit here is working to reduce the actual compliance you face. And so you can do this equally well for federal, state private restricted funding, but we're just going to talk about federal really quickly, so we have lots of time for Q&A. So these are just some example strategies. But in general, I work with clients about how to allocate federal dollars. My favorite thing to spend them on, the right thing for most clients I work with, is salaries, because there can be pretty low compliance labor around doing that if they're allowable salaries. So if you put an extra teacher in your room, in a classroom that wasn't paid for with state money the year before, generally speaking, Title I can pay for that teacher. And if that's their full-time work, then your compliance around that is going to be time certification twice a year. Really easy to accomplish. You got to make sure you do it, but it's only twice a year. You got to be careful with this a little bit, though, because let's say that person is an extra teacher in the classroom 75% of their time, and then 25% of their time they're working on your intervention team or doing some other work. In that case, the compliance burden explodes by at least 26 times, and that you have to do a weekly personnel activity report for them that shows the breakdown of their time. 75% here, 25% there, whatever it is. That has to be filled out by them weekly, has to be signed by their manager weekly, and you have to put it on file. If your strategy is tight, you have to do that twice a year. If it's not, you have to do it 52 times a year. Give or take some for summer break, but something to think about as you look at your strategies for spending federal money. Other places that I tend to go with a lot of clients here are pedagogical software and professional development. Those tend to be pretty acceptable, easy to find allowable expenses and low compliance around them. Same with like contractors. Like if your intervention program is all done through 1099 contractors, then that tends to be a pretty straightforward way. You have to check your licensing requirements or make sure that you're compliant across all of your compliance silos. But generally, that's a good place to allocate money. And same with, especially with ESSER coming up, anything you're doing that is extra learning, extended day, summer school, after school. I know a series of schools in DC are splitting up. They're making a wholly separate virtual classroom department from the live classroom, so no teachers have to do hybrid. Anything that's like that, that's really easily showable as addressing learning loss, is going to be like chef's kiss for ESSER. It's just brilliant. It's what they're looking for, and a big intention behind all of that money. All right, let's jump to the next slide. So those are the ideas that we wanted to talk with you about, and excited to get to the Q&A. Really quickly, just want to touch on, I would love to work with any and all of you here today. And I think I put a few bullet points up there of some things I've thought of or work that I've done with other clients, but anything that sits in your CFO or COO suite, I would be thrilled to talk with you about, whether that's building this kind of integrated, strategic, proactive budget process over a full year, to just helping you sit down and strategize ESSER funding and how you connect that to your title funding, so that you have a process you can go back to year after year for understanding how to do that really well and methodically and strategically. And likewise, Aditya has some ideas of some follow-up stuff that might happen.
Oh yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. And just briefly here, want to say if anything you saw in that demo piqued your interest and you want to check it out, see how it could apply to your context in the schools that you work with, feel free to reach out and we can arrange a quick demo and see how you can use this to track budget versus actuals, plan your upcoming budgets. We know that ESSER money, a lot of you don't know yet how much you're going to get, especially for those later waves. And so once you do have that amount that's promised to you by the state and distributed to you, making a plan around that, those are all things that can be done really effectively in the ESSER's platform. And then, jointly, Chris and I, would be happy to, create tailored additional finance PDs for you and your teams, your non-finance leaders as well. And then have, sort of the 1-2 combination of having new robust digital cloud-based tools alongside, the expert advice that Chris brings from his work with school systems across the country. So with that, we will transition to Q&A. And Thank you again to those of you who submitted, pre-survey questions. A couple of topics that came up through there that we'll talk through first, and then please feel free to add additional questions in the Q&A here as well, and we'll handle those as we're able to. But one was around eligibility for these new funds. Am I eligible? How do I find that out? And the general answer here is that if you are receiving Title I dollars regularly already, you're most likely going to be eligible for at least the ESSER funding. The GEAR funding, of course, is governor discretionary. Some of that can go to higher ed, but you're likely to receive, and if you've already received ESSER I funds, you should almost certainly be receiving ESSER II and ARPA ESSER funds as well in larger quantities than that first ESSER I tranche. So folks who had reached out and said, am I eligible for this? The answer is probably yes, if any of those other conditions are already true. Chris, do you want to take the next one? And I think you sort of answered this a little bit in one of the Q&A questions online.
Absolutely, and forgive me, Aditya, could you point me to which one we're on? As I was working on an answer in the Q&A section there, so I wasn't. I had you in the background in my headset.
Sure, just timing of when funds are going to come down the pipe.
Oh, sure. So yeah, I mean, I think that I was just talking with Anna about this before we started. I think that Anna and folks at any charters and New York Charter School Association probably have the best information about this. But like my general understanding is that New York just has not come out with the funding, with the amounts for LEAs, for charters, for ESSER 2 and 3. And if it's helpful to know, just contextually, I'm working with a group in North Carolina and I'm working with a group in Louisiana on their applications and on their budget plan, their budget processes in general. And I'd say in North Carolina, all of the amounts are out already and the application process is already out and set up. The first application deadline for ESSERs 2 and 3 is May 7th. So they're really like rolling there. And that deadline is if they want to be able to access funds this fiscal year, if they're trying to run summer school and use those funds. Then they're going to roll applications through to September 30th. So that's the process in North Carolina. In Louisiana, the State Department of Ed has released percentages of the entire award and set up an application process for the first like 20% or thereabouts of the awards. Similarly to how sometimes state allocations can work in various states where you get allocated throughout the year and it gets updated based on some type of ADM data. So they've kicked it off, but I'd say schools I'm working with in Louisiana still feel a little bit of your frustration in that they're like, I want to be able to plan for this being 20% and the rest being 4 times that, but I'm not sure that I can. And I haven't actually seen the numbers and I don't want to commit. So a frustrating position to be in, I think, and yeah. I'm sorry that you're there. But yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Just super quickly, and I'll just echo what Chris said, what we've heard from SED. So no, the numbers for rounds 2 and 3 are not out, and no, the applications are not out, but that they, it was communicated earlier this month that it would be in April. And so watch your emails closely. It really literally could be any day. We have seen, now SED also put out a memo, so their formal stance is not what I'm about to tell you, which is that no calculations have been made and they're not public or formal until they've been made. But we've seen some estimates that for the third round of funding over the course of multiple years, so not just for 1 year, it's estimated to be $3,000 per student for charter students in New York. And Chris, I appreciate it. You were exchanging some communication with Tom in the Q&A. There are a handful of schools, very unfortunately, who have not previously received title funds, either because they were new or because their title enrollment was beneath the threshold and they weren't at the time part of a consortium that would allow them to receive those funds. They continue to be ineligible. Charters are not the only schools for whom this is true. And I think increasingly the federal government is aware of the sort of small but important number of schools for whom this is true nationally. And so I think it's very possible that future rounds of funding will address this. It's also possible that some of the governor's discretionary funds that Chris was speaking to might have the potential to address this. But as of right now, the 3 rounds as they stand cannot serve schools that have not previously received title funds, including, as someone asked in the Q&A, Kern is asking, are new charter schools who are welcoming students for the first time in September eligible? The answer is no. But sorry to interject, Chris. I'll hand it back over to you, gents.
Yeah, no, that's super, super helpful, and thanks for tackling those. And I think you guys are much deeper experts, clearly and obviously, on New York specific, processes and allocations. So it's helpful to know, and a good learning moment for me and Aditya as well. All right, let's look at what can we allocate funds towards. And so after we clear out of this Q&A slide 2, we're going to jump into the Q&A part of the Zoom. So just that's coming. Sorry, can you bear with me 1 second? I lost my Zoom window. So what can we allocate funds towards? So, I mean, in general, if you're talking, I'm going to assume this is probably an ESSER question. ESSER is subject to uniform guidance, like all federal dollars are. And so it has kind of cost principles and processes and procedures, purchasing procedures there laid out. And so you have to follow all of those. That is an enormous document that is far too long to cover in an answer. But you can certainly look that up and start to familiarize yourself with it if you're not already. And then on top of that, there are, depending on the one you're talking about, some different provisions. Some of them are targeted toward learning loss. Some of them are just general, like it has to be in the generally accepted expenditures for schools. So maybe what's helpful is to talk a little bit about what conversations I've been a part of across the country and how people are thinking about this. So generally, people are worried about creating a fiscal cliff, right? So they're worried about, we need to address learning loss and we need to do that aggressively, but I don't want to hire 6 extra teachers or 16 extra teachers or however many extra teachers and then have the funding run out in 2023 and have to then let them all go, or face that, like, I need to find that funding from elsewhere. And this is a large pool of funding. So that's on people's minds. I think some people are addressing that by continuing to hire, but being clear about, hey, this is a 2-year funded role, and we want to bring you in, and we want to tackle these goals. We want to catch students up from a year that was very different and very difficult. Some people are doing it with consultants. I watched a really savvy finance team put together a whole presentation around, here is our core model of school that we have built, that we have, we've gone through years of creating it, and that is fully funded and operational. It's fine. It doesn't need any ESSER money, doesn't need any extra money. We have figured out how to do that with our regular money that will always be there, unless something enormous changes in education. And then they said, here's the ESSER. Here are all the things that we're going to do layered on top of that. We're going to do extended day. We're going to say, this is the same group that is setting up a wholly separate wing of their school where they'll just do virtual there, so that they're not going to ask teachers to do hybrid, because one of the feedback that they got from their teachers is that the hardest thing to do is teach 10 kids in person and 10 kids at home at the same time. So they're just going to split that, and they're going to use ESSER money to fund that. That will only be for a year, so it works well in terms of not creating a fiscal cliff. Some people are looking at capital improvements in their schools, particularly as they're related to COVID stuff, like revamping HVAC systems or addressing some longstanding building issues that they've had. People are tackling some of that. You need to do that very carefully because capital expenditures can sometimes trigger extra compliance steps. So you need to do it carefully, though that is a specified use of ESSER from the federal government. So like you're probably going to be okay. Just tread carefully and read the guidance. So let me leave it at that so we can tackle some other questions. But say in general that like this is the kind of stuff that I help guide people through, and tools like Aditya's are the kind of tools that would be useful for managing a pretty complex and large new pool of money coming in with tight restrictions.
And Chris, I think that also brings us to this fourth topic here that was submitted by one of the folks in the pre-survey, is like, how do we actually innovate with these funds and not just use it to do more of what we've already done? And I think that's where it comes back to that core philosophy of how are you aligning your budget to strategy and goals, right? And not just looking for ways to plug holes left by state funding or other pools of funding, but really thinking through what strategic investments do we want to make on behalf of our students over the next few years that we have access to these funds. And so setting specific outcome goals or initiatives that you want to invest in, and then deploying these funds to those new innovations is a totally appropriate and encouraged use of these pools of funding to really think outside the box of how do we serve students who've been really most negatively impacted by this pandemic. So appreciate the submission of that question before as well. There was one question that was answered that one of the attendees brought up here on which year does the NYSED use for figuring out how much you get. And unfortunately, it's the 2019 to 2020 school year based on how much your Title I appropriations were then. So if you're a network that's growing, you've been adding a lot of students, or you're a new one like Kern was asking about, unfortunately, all your appropriations out of these ESSER funds are going to be based back on 2019 to 2020 numbers, is my current understanding. And Chris or Anna, feel free to jump in if that's off.
That's correct.
I was just going to jump in and say the same. So let's tackle, I think there's a really, this is an interesting question here about what do you view as like the biggest risks in terms of spending areas? And again, I'm going to assume this is like for federal dollars, which tend to come with the tightest restrictions. So, I mean, one big thing to stay away from is like, is big capital purchases in general, right? Like there's a threshold. I would have to go back and I have not worked on this in a while, so I have to go back and remind myself of the amount. It was $150,000 or $250,000. Where if you're making a capital purchase, so essentially if you're buying a building or you're buying like a fleet of buses, there's a threshold past which you're going to trigger a federal interest process. That process, I've never taken anybody through it because all I've ever learned about it is that you should avoid it at all costs. And it takes, what I've heard back from people is it takes a couple of years. But basically it's a process where you spent so much federal money on buying a big asset that the federal government is going to figure out how much of that asset it owns and is going to expect for you to track that equity and pay it back if you ever dispose of that asset. I worked with a Head Start program who had 4 buildings it was supposed to inherit that it couldn't inherit for 3 years because they were tied up in a federal interest process from the previous Head Start awardee. So something to be aware of. Other things, I think that some of the trickiest areas are just the following procurement processes there. The federal government lays out pretty strict procurement processes. In general, state departments of ed kind of have even more restrictive ones. So if you're following those already, then you're probably okay, but it's worth going and paying attention to. These are like thresholds for over which you need to do a full RFP process. Or ranges within which you don't have to do a full RFP, but you always have to have 3 bids filed away. And these are things that auditors will from time to time, either independent or at the state or federal level, come in and ask you for. So a couple of ideas of things to stay away from, but it's a big world out there. So there's lots of areas to cover there. Happy to pick that conversation up one-on-one.
Yeah, and Chris, just to jump in on this too, I would say the general intent of this legislation is to create flexibility for you in your budgets, but there are some stipulations, like on the learning loss ones, so the most recent ARP-ESSER in particular, it calls out this idea of like evidence-based mitigation strategies for learning loss. And so as you're, choosing different things to invest in and claiming that as learning loss usage, there has to be some evidence basis that you're providing to the federal government on, what's the evidence that this investment is actually addressing learning loss. So that in particular may be one risk as you're thinking about tagging things to learning loss. But in general, again, this money is meant for you to, to the point of one of the previous questions, innovate and make the best decisions that you can for your students to serve them with these resources. Chris, we got a couple last questions here that I'm wondering if you can run through real quick, and then I did want to.
So really quickly.
This up
yeah,
for exiting.
I'm sorry, talking over you a bit. Yeah. Really quickly, Title IIA funding. As far as I know, it still has the time cert requirements that federal funding does in general, that title funds do in general. I'm happy to look into that and make sure that that's right and follow up. But as far as I know, that's if you're using that to fund salaries, you're still going to have the same compliance requirements. Competitive bidding. So one, you want to look specifically to the guidance for ESSER to answer those questions. And if it's not there tackled specifically, then default to the uniform guidance, which you can, here, I've actually got it up in the web browser. Let me toss it into the typed answer. It's just a link to the full uniform guidance, but that's where you want to go to tackle those. So if you're looking at big purchases, make sure you just go read those sections. There, it wouldn't those and make sure you're in alignment with them. There also might be some resources that New York Charter Schools Association or any charters have, and it's like some guides. I don't know if you guys have finance guides like that, but sometimes those exist out there. But always the official guidance should be your litmus test for that stuff.
All right. On that note, I know we're at the top of the hour here. Like I said, I'm going to leave our contact information here if you'd like to reach out to either of us about, other ways that we can support you as you engage in this important work. Thank you again, Anna and team, for allowing us to present to this great group today. And I'll leave it to you, Anna, for any closing words that you might have.
Thank you both so much. So appreciate it. And certainly we will blast out when we know that the application and the allocation amounts for the second 2 rounds are available. And we'll be happy to facilitate additional conversations about programming decisions or brainstorming about highest and best uses of these funds above and beyond, thinking about the funding Tetris that we discussed today. And pencil in May 19th for your boards, a little bit of a 101 in terms of these funds and the considerations that they should have in terms of their ongoing governance and decision making. So thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate it. Take care.